April 6, 1932. 8:41 p.m. Lenox Avenue. 6 white men were paid to follow Stephanie St. Clair, certain she'd panic, beg, or run. She didn't. By midnight, 5 had vanished. 1 stayed, and his description became the problem. April 6, 1932. 8:41 p.m. Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The rain had just stopped, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, just a steady pressure that leaves the city looking freshly polished and slightly suspicious. Street lamps turned puddles into mirrors. Every storefront window held a second Harlem, trembling in the water. Somewhere above the street noise, a trumpet ran scales. 1 man 3 floors up, practicing like tomorrow depended on it. Down below, the streetcar groaned along the tracks, metal on metal, and the air carried a thin mix of wet pavement, tobacco, and hot food from a late-night counter that would never admit it was struggling. Stephanie St. Clair walked south on Lenox as if the sidewalk had been built for her stride. Not fast. Not slow. Exact. 5'7", tailored coat fitted clean at the waist, dark gloves, and a string of pearls that caught the light only when the city allowed it. Her hat sat perfectly, the kind of precision that didn't come from vanity, it came from discipline. The kind a woman learns when the world keeps trying to read her as something smaller. She did not look back. Behind her, 6 men moved in a loose, practiced pattern, close enough to keep her in sight, far enough to pretend it was coincidence. Their shoes were too clean for Harlem. Their coats looked expensive in the way money looks when it's meant to intimidate, not impress. White men. Outsiders. Paid confidence. One of them, broad across the shoulders, fedora pulled low, kept his cigarette cupped in his palm like he was protecting something precious. Another walked with the careful ease of someone who believed the law was a suggestion when spoken in the wrong neighborhood. They had been given simple instructions. Follow her. Learn her habits. Learn her people. Learn her doors. Their boss's logic was crude but common. A woman, especially a black immigrant woman, would eventually show fear. And fear always revealed the map. A thin man in the back muttered, almost amused, "This is it? Just tailing a lady?" The broad one didn't turn his head. "Don't say lady. Boss said she's got a name. Queenie." Another man snorted. "Queenie? Like that means something." "It means she's been here longer than we've been alive," the broad one said. "So stay sharp." Stephanie passed a fruit stand. The vendor looked up, not surprised, not curious, just aware. A glance that lasted half a second and carried the quiet recognition of a neighborhood that knows its pillars. She continued. The 6 men continued. They expected a nervous rhythm, hesitation, a sudden stop, a quickened pace. But Stephanie's pace remained steady, like she was walking to an appointment that couldn't be missed. At 8:52 p.m. she took a turn. Nothing dramatic, nothing hurried. Just a clean shift toward 135th Street, then into a side stretch where the lamps were fewer and the shadows held their breath longer. The formation behind her hesitated for the first time. The thin man said, "Did she make us?" The broad one answered, flat and controlled. "If she made us, she changed speed. Keep moving." They followed. The air was colder on this block, the wet stone giving off a chill that slipped into coat sleeves. Their footsteps sounded louder here, amplified by the narrowness of the street and the slick pavement. And still, Stephanie didn't turn. She stopped briefly under a building light, just long enough to take a key from her glove, just long enough for the men to close the distance by a few steps. The thin man's mouth tightened. He wanted her to notice him. Wanted proof that he could rattle her. He stepped closer than the others. Too close. Stephanie unlocked the door without looking up. No tremor in her hand. No sudden breath. Not even the performance of calm that nervous people imitate when they're trying to survive. The door swung inward. From inside the building a voice emerged, black, middle-aged, steady. "Evening, madam." Madam. Not miss. Not lady. Not something thrown like a coin to test if she'd pick it up. "Madam," said the way you address a woman who owns the room even when she's only passing through it. Stephanie's head tilted the slightest degree. Acknowledgement, not gratitude. The man inside held the door with the posture of respect that doesn't ask permission to exist. And on the sidewalk something shifted. The thin man, still too close, felt it in his ribs before he understood it with his mind. She wasn't alone in Harlem. Harlem was with her. Harlem was watching. He swallowed and stepped back. He tried to recover with a whisper, as if saving face in front of the night. She's too visible." The broad one cut his eyes toward him. "We're the ones standing out. The thin man flicked his cigarette into a puddle, stamped it out. And then he did something none of them expected to do this early. He quit. No dramatic exit. No argument. Just a turn, a fast walk into the darker end of the block, like he could vanish into the city and pretend this decision had never been made. 1 down. 5 left. Stephanie disappeared into the stairwell. The door closed behind her with a final ordinary sound, wood meeting frame, a lock catching. And the 5 men left on the street stared at that closed door as if it had insulted them. One of them, quieter than the rest, said, "Why do I feel like we're the ones being measured?" No one answered. Because in that moment the job stopped feeling like surveillance. It started feeling like a test. And the night, Harlem's wet, watchful night, was still young. Before 6 men ever learned her walking pace, before they argued over corners and reflections and whether she could be frightened, Stephanie St. Clair had already lived a longer, harder surveillance. Not by gangsters. By the city itself. Lower Manhattan. A gray morning with salt in the air and too many languages pressed into one line. Stephanie stepped off the ship with a coat that held its shape and a small cloth pouch stitched into the lining, $200 protected like a heartbeat. She was 26. Caribbean-born. Martinique raised. And she carried herself the way immigrants learn to carry themselves when they can feel the inspection before anyone speaks. At Ellis Island, the officials didn't need to shout to make you smaller. They had softer tools. Paperwork, waiting, the slow humiliation of being processed like an object. A clerk glanced at her name as if it were an inconvenience. He tried to simplify it. "St. Clair," he said, testing the syllables like they didn't belong to him. Stephanie's eyes stayed level. Her accent, French Creole layered under years of careful English, didn't disappear, but she didn't apologize for it either. "That is my name," she said, quiet and certain. The clerk looked up, surprised by the steadiness. He wrote it down correctly, maybe out of respect, maybe because he didn't want trouble before lunch. Stephanie didn't care which. She only cared about results. That was the first lesson New York gave her. Power rarely announces itself. It simply decides. Harlem in 1912 wasn't the Harlem the papers romanticized later. It was a neighborhood in motion. Black families arriving from the South, Caribbean immigrants arriving from the islands, brownstones filling with people who understood, in their bones, that ownership was the only form of safety America respected. Stephanie learned the map by riding the streetcar. Midtown by day, domestic service, white homes, polished floors, quiet insults delivered with smiles. Harlem by evening, windows full of cooking light, music leaking from clubs that didn't have to pretend they belonged to anyone else. The streetcar tracks stitched those worlds together like a seam, and Stephanie sat by the window watching, studying, counting. She didn't come to New York to be liked. She came to build something that could not be taken with a single decision from a clerk. One winter night, 1917, late, cold enough to make your lungs feel sharp, she stood outside a small Harlem beauty parlor and watched 2 women place nickels on a 3-digit number. The exchange was casual, almost tender. A slip of paper. A coin. A promise. The numbers. Technically illegal. Functionally, a private bank Harlem built for itself when banks refused to lend black people dignity, let alone money. Stephanie didn't rush in like a thief. She watched it the way a strategist watches a machine. Not for the shine but for the gears. In the mornings, runners collected slips from barbershops, churches, kitchens, and corners. At noon, the city's published financial figures determined the winning number, publicly verifiable, hard to rig. In the evenings, payouts moved back through the neighborhood like a second paycheck, sometimes the only one a family saw that week. It was gambling, yes. It was also payroll. By the mid-1920s, Harlem's numbers economy was generating an estimated $30 million a year across the neighborhood. Money that fed rent, groceries, church collections, and school shoes. And because it moved through people, not institutions, it required one ingredient above all else. Trust. Stephanie understood trust the way she understood arithmetic, as something precise, earned, and unforgiving. She began saving with a discipline that bordered on severe. She refused small luxuries. She refused distractions. She read newspapers until the edges softened. She asked questions without sounding like questions. She listened more than she spoke. And when she spoke, she made sure her words landed like facts, not wishes. By 1923 she had done what most people only talk about doing. She had saved $10,000. Not inherited. Not gifted. Earned and guarded, dollar by dollar, in a city that preferred black women to remain dependent. That money became her entrance fee into power. But Stephanie didn't buy territory the way men bought territory. She built infrastructure. A quiet office near 136th Street, unremarkable from the outside, where the work looked less like crime and more like banking. Ledgers, pencils, adding machines, envelopes stacked clean, routes written out with the care of a train schedule. She hired runners from Harlem and she paid on time. Every time. The neighborhood noticed. A young runner once asked her, half joking, half afraid to be heard, if she worried about being cheated. Stephanie didn't look up from the ledger. Her pen continued moving, steady as a metronome. "If you must steal," she said, "steal from a man who does not know your name. Here, I know everyone's name." The room went still for a second. Then the work continued. That was her method. No speeches, no drama, just inevitability. Within 3 years she ran numbers across 40 city blocks. By 1928, her operation was estimated to generate around $200,000 a year. Money so large it became difficult for polite society to imagine coming from a black immigrant woman in Harlem without insisting it must be temporary, unstable, a mistake that would correct itself. Stephanie made sure it did not correct itself. She employed more than 150 runners, many of them people the formal economy had decided were disposable. Black men who couldn't get steady work. Black women shut out of respectable positions. Older men who knew the streets better than any police captain ever would. She built a payroll system that kept Harlem breathing during years when the city's official systems offered nothing but paperwork and closed doors. And she did something else, something men like her enemies rarely understood until it was too late. She protected people. Not as charity. As policy. On Friday afternoons, envelopes moved through the neighborhood that had nothing to do with number slips. Quiet help for families behind on rent, payments to grocers for households that had run out of credit, contributions to legal defense funds when Harlem residents got arrested on charges that smelled like fabricated quotas. Stephanie never announced those envelopes. She never turned them into a performance. She understood that public generosity invites public control. Her generosity was private, strategic, and it made loyalty feel less like fear and more like belonging. Every Sunday morning she walked into Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street and sat in the third row. Same posture. Same controlled elegance. Hat pinned just right. Pearls resting at her throat like punctuation. The church wasn't just religion in Harlem. It was legitimacy. A moral center. A place where reputations were weighed without needing the police to do it. After service one morning, an older man, an usher with silver hair and a face that had seen too much, stopped her near the vestibule. "Madame St. Clair," he said softly, careful with the name. "People talk." Stephanie's eyes stayed calm. "People always talk." He leaned in just enough to be heard. "They say you're becoming too large." Stephanie held his gaze, no anger, no smile. Just the quiet of someone deciding what truth is useful. "Tell the people," she said, "I became large because Harlem needed something the banks would not give." The usher studied her for a long second, then nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. That's how Harlem worked. It didn't worship. It assessed. Stephanie built her real power base in those assessments, in the way shop owners watched her runners behave, in the way families remembered who helped them when the winter got long, in the way women in church hats noticed whether her elegance was arrogance or armor. And while she built that public foundation, she built a second one underground. Information. She cultivated relationships with the editors at the New York Amsterdam News, not with threats and not with begging but with something far more valuable, a reputation for accuracy. When she handed over evidence of police corruption, it wasn't rumor. It was names, dates, amounts, patterns. It was leverage dressed as fact. She also maintained careful contacts inside Harlem precincts, the 28th and the 32nd, not through crude bribery that could be turned against her, but through an exchange of knowledge. Who was honest? Who was compromised? Who was taking money from outside operators? Who was ambitious enough to sell his badge for a promotion? Stephanie filed it all away like a chess player memorizes positions. Not for today. For the moment when a man with a gun would finally meet a woman with a folder. That's what the 6 men on Lenox Avenue didn't understand in 1932. They thought they were following a person. They were following an architecture. A woman who had crossed an ocean and refused to let a clerk rename her. A woman who had turned arithmetic into employment. A woman who had built a community pact so quiet and so firm that doors opened for her without being asked. So when the first man dropped out that night, when his nerve cracked and he vanished into the dark, it wasn't because Stephanie threatened him. It was because he felt for the first time what real power feels like up close. Not loud. Not violent. Just prepared. And the men who hired him were about to learn the same lesson. Because the more closely you watch Stephanie St. Clair, the more obvious it becomes. She isn't being hunted. She's gathering names. April 7, 1932. 6:12 a.m. Harlem wakes up in layers. First the delivery trucks, wooden crates, tired shocks, men with collars up against the chill. Then the streetcars, sparking faintly as they pull the neighborhood into motion. Then the voices, a butcher unlocking steel shutters, a woman sweeping her stoop, a boy calling out the morning papers like he's announcing a verdict. And somewhere between those layers the decision gets made, quietly, the way most dangerous decisions are. Downtown, in a room that smelled like cigar smoke and wet wool, the men who'd ordered last night's tale sat around a table and talked about Stephanie St. Clair as if she were a problem of physics. Not a person. A problem. She's a woman, one of them said, like it was a calculation, not an insult. They always crack the same way. Give it pressure, it shows you where it's weak. Another voice, older, calmer, answered without looking up from his coffee. You're thinking like a man who's only ever scared men. A third one laughed. Come on. Harlem's running numbers and a lady's in charge? That's a story for newspapers. Not real life. That was the mistake. Not that they underestimated her strength. They underestimated her system. By 7:08 a.m., Harlem was already doing what Harlem always did, moving money in small, careful increments. A nickel here. A dime there. A slip of paper folded tight like a secret. The formal banks south of 110th Street didn't want this business. They didn't want these people. So Harlem built a second economy right on the sidewalk. And Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie, sat at the center of it. At 7:26 a.m., inside a modest office that didn't look like power from the outside, a runner named Dorothy Sims stood near the doorway with her coat still on, cheeks cold from the street. She wasn't breathless. She wasn't panicked. But her eyes carried a message. Madam, she said, voice low, 2 men were asking about the 7th Avenue route. Not customers. Not players. Stephanie didn't ask what they looked like. She didn't need to. She turned one page in a ledger, slow, deliberate, like she refused to let urgency own the room. Did they speak to you, she asked, or at you? Dorothy hesitated. At me. Stephanie's pen stopped. Just for a beat. Then it moved again. That tells me enough, Stephanie said. Sit. Warm your hands. Dorothy sat, confused by the calm. They said it won't be mine much longer. That the routes will change hands. Stephanie didn't react to the threat. She reacted to the structure of it. Did they say a name? She asked. No, Dorothy said. But they wanted me to hear the accent. They wanted me to carry it back. Stephanie nodded once, almost imperceptibly. A message is never just words, she said. It is always an audience. At 8:03 a.m., Winston Pace came in through the back entrance. 23 years old, tall, shoulders too tight from a night without sleep. He worked her 128th Street corridor, barbershops, stoops, beauty parlors, a few kitchens where old women kept their money in biscuit tins because they did not trust anything with a bank's name on it. Winston didn't sit right away. He stood like a man waiting to be blamed. They stopped me, he said. 2 of them. White. Clean shoes. Like they were trying to show me they didn't belong here. Stephanie looked up at him, not angry, not soft. Measured. What did you do? She asked. I listened, Winston said, ashamed of the word. Stephanie's gaze held him steady. You listened, she repeated, turning it into something useful. Good. When a man shows you his mouth, he shows you his plan. Did you notice the car? Winston blinked. The car? The car, Stephanie said patiently. Dark sedan. 2-door. The left headlight was dimmer. Like it had been repaired, Winston said, surprised at himself. He didn't know he'd been watching that closely. Stephanie wrote it down. Not because she loved details. Because details loved her. At 9:11 a.m., she took a call from a man inside one of Harlem's precinct houses. Someone who owed her nothing officially, but who had learned over years that Stephanie St. Clair's information tended to be the kind that kept careers intact. He spoke carefully as if even the telephone wires had ears. They've been asking questions, he said. Not here, around. Names. Routes. Who pays who? Stephanie's voice stayed level. And what did you tell them? Pause. Nothing, the man said. Because it sounded like they were trying to make me say it. Stephanie let the silence sit just long enough to communicate approval without flattery. Good, she said. If they want stories, let them buy a newspaper. She hung up and stared at the wall for 3 full seconds, long enough to run the geometry in her head. This wasn't a robbery. It was reconnaissance. Men who plan to take something don't start by breaking windows. They start by drawing maps. So Stephanie did what she always did when men arrived with force. She refused to meet them where force was strongest. She moved first, not with muscle but with position. At 10:02 a.m. she walked out onto Lenox Avenue in daylight, because daylight is its own kind of weapon. Harlem was watching, and she wanted Harlem to see her unbothered. She stopped at a corner where a shoeshine man worked and spoke to him softly as if asking about polish. 2 blocks away, a pair of white men stood pretending to wait for nothing. Stephanie didn't glance at them. But she saw their reflection in the glass of a storefront window, hat brims, stiff shoulders, the way their eyes kept searching for a reaction they could report back like prophet. A man passing by, black, middle-aged, work coat, tilted his head barely an inch as he crossed Stephanie's path. A micro-gesture. Not a greeting. A signal. Stephanie gave the smallest nod back. Harlem had its own telegraph. It didn't need wires. By 11:30 a.m., the pressure shifted from watching Stephanie to pressing her people. That was always the move with men who believe power is a chain. Break the links, the center collapses. 2 runners were approached near 125th. A third was questioned outside a beauty parlor on 7th. A fourth was followed after a pickup. Nothing loud. Nothing criminal enough to bring headlines. Just enough to make fear contagious. Stephanie knew that tactic because she'd lived it. First as a black immigrant woman watched by landlords, employers, police, and strangers who felt entitled to her smallness. The city had tried to train her into shrinking. It hadn't worked. At 1:14 p.m. she returned to 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. 4th floor. West-facing windows. The kind of building where the hallway stayed quiet because the walls were thick and the neighbors had paid for peace. Inside her apartment, the air smelled faintly of ink and tea. Her desk was waiting. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, not thick, not dramatic. Just paper. Names. Dates. Small facts arranged like matches. Dorothy stood nearby, hands folded, trying not to show the fear she carried for other people. "Madam," she said carefully, "are we going to answer them?" Stephanie didn't look up. "We are," she said. "But not with noise." Winston shifted his weight in the doorway. "What do you want us to do?" Stephanie finally raised her eyes. Not at Winston alone, at the idea behind the question. "Today," she said, "you do your routes exactly the same. You do not rush. You do not hide. You do not change your habits for men who haven't earned the privilege of shaping your day." Dorothy frowned. "And if they touch someone?" Stephanie's voice lowered, not in fear, in precision. "Then they will have changed the kind of war they're in," she said. "And I will respond accordingly." She stood, smoothing her coat like she was preparing for church, not conflict. "Listen to me," Stephanie said, and now the room tightened around her words. "They believe this is a man's world. That is why they think intimidation is enough. We will not give them the satisfaction of our panic." She picked up the telephone. Dialed 1 number. Let it ring once. Twice. A man answered. Someone in the newspaper world, someone used to weighing truth against consequence. Stephanie didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. "I want you reachable tonight," she said. "And I want you ready tomorrow." A pause on the other end. "Madame St. Clair, what's happening?" Stephanie's mouth barely moved. "What's happening," she said, "is that some men are making the mistake of thinking they can study me without being studied back." She hung up. At 4:40 p.m., as the afternoon light went soft over Sugar Hill, she moved a small stack of documents into a plain envelope and handed it to a trusted courier. No speech. No drama. Just a transfer of weight. And as the city darkened again, street lamps humming back to life, puddles returning to mirrors, Stephanie St. Clair sat at her desk and began to write. Not because she was afraid. Because she was ready. The men downtown had hired 6 shadows to learn her routes. They didn't understand the price of that curiosity. Because Stephanie wasn't waiting for them to make the next move. She was already counting names. April 7, 1932. 9:18 p.m. Harlem. The second night didn't feel like the first. The first night had been wet pavement and swagger. 6 men treating Lenox Avenue like a hallway they could own for the price of a paycheck. The second night had a different temperature. Not colder in the air. Colder in the confidence. 5 of them were still pretending this was routine. But even they could feel it now. Harlem wasn't just a place you entered. Harlem was a place that noticed you entering. The man who stayed, the one who would later be asked to describe this woman, was named Frank Doyle. That wasn't the name he used downtown when men were buying whiskey with cash and buying silence with threats. But it was the name on his union card, and the name he'd used before he learned that some jobs paid more when you didn't ask questions. Frank wasn't young. Early 30s maybe. The kind of man whose face already looked older than his age because he'd trained himself to keep it neutral. He dressed plain, no flashy tie, no loud coat, because he believed in disappearing. He carried a small notebook in his inside pocket. Not because he romanticized the work. Because he respected it. At 9:23 p.m., they reformed on Lenox, downwind of a bar where laughter spilled out like heat. Stephanie St. Clair appeared on the sidewalk with the same measured pace, the same controlled elegance, dark coat, gloves, pearls. Harlem light caught the pearl line once, like a blade flashing, then it vanished back into shadow. No one told Frank who she was. He already knew what men whispered, Queenie? Madam. The number's Queen. What he didn't understand, what his bosses hadn't paid him enough to understand, was that Stephanie St. Clair didn't move like a target. She moved like a woman with appointments. Frank watched the spacing. The way the other men tried to box her in without looking like they were doing it. The way they kept turning their heads too often, checking if anyone was watching them watch her. Their nerves irritated him. One of them, a jittery kid with a narrow jaw, muttered, "This is stupid. We got what we need. She goes home. Big deal." Frank didn't answer. Because Stephanie didn't go home. At 9:31 p.m. she turned east, not sharp, not sudden, toward 7th Avenue, then slowed near a bright storefront window. She didn't stop. She didn't look around. She just let the window hold her reflection for half a breath. And in that reflection, Frank saw what the others missed. Her eyes weren't searching behind her. They were checking angles. Not fear. Geometry. She resumed walking. Same pace. The kid behind Frank said, "You think she's made us?" Frank's voice stayed low. "If she made you, you wouldn't feel this comfortable." At 9:38 p.m., Stephanie stepped toward a man at the curb, black, middle-aged, a work coat with the shoulders worn soft. Their exchange was quick. Not a handshake. Not even a full stop. Just a brief lean-in like two people swapping weather. Frank strained for words, but the street swallowed them. What he caught wasn't language. It was posture. The man's shoulders were relaxed. His eyes didn't flick around. There was no nervousness in him at all. As if whatever was happening here, it wasn't danger. It was routine. Stephanie moved on. And the man at the curb turned his head, ever so slightly, toward the street behind her, toward the 6 men. His look wasn't aggressive. It was informational. He was simply taking inventory. Frank felt something crawl up the back of his neck. Not fear. Recognition. Harlem is watching us, he thought. Not her. At 9:47 p.m., the broad-shouldered leader, Tony, the others called him, pulled the crew in tight behind a parked car. "This ain't supposed to be complicated," Tony whispered. "We're not touching her. We're just learning her routes." A fourth man, older, rough hands, snapped, "Learning? You don't learn a neighborhood like this by walking around with white faces and new shoes." Tony's jaw clenched. "You want to quit. But don't do it loud." The older man exhaled hard, like he'd been holding it all day. "This ain't my kind of job." He walked off. 2 down. The kid looked at Frank as if asking permission. Frank didn't give it. He didn't even look at him. The kid took that as his answer and slipped away into the dark. 3 down. Now it was only Tony, Frank, and one other man, quiet, heavy-lidded, the type who didn't talk because he didn't want his voice remembered. Tony whispered, furious, "Cowards." Frank finally spoke, calm and flat. "They're not cowards. They're locals now. They just figured it out quicker." Tony bristled. Figured what out? Frank didn't answer yet. Because Stephanie had turned again. At 10:03 p.m., she crossed 135th Street with the same composure, but the neighborhood changed around her. Fewer bars. Fewer loud corners. More quiet buildings with better doors. Sugar Hill territory, money tucked into Harlem's higher ground. Stephanie walked like she belonged there because she did. They followed at a distance. And then it happened again, the thing that didn't make sense to men downtown who thought power only looked like guns and shouting. A building door opened before she reached it. Not wide. Not dramatic. Just enough. A man held it from inside, visible for a second in the light. Black, middle-aged, clean collar, calm face. He didn't look at her like she was lucky to be allowed inside. He looked at her like she was expected. "Evening, madam," he said, clear as a church bell. "Madam." Stephanie didn't smile. She didn't perform warmth. She gave him a small nod, acknowledgement, not thanks, and stepped through. The door shut with a soft finality. Tony stared at it like it had insulted him. The quiet man beside Tony muttered, That's it? She just goes in? Tony snapped. Yeah. That's it. But Frank wasn't watching the door anymore. He was watching the street. Because the same man who'd held the door had also looked out, just once, down the sidewalk. Not scanning for danger. Scanning for confirmation. As if he'd been waiting to see whether Stephanie came alone. Or whether she brought company. Frank realized then, the doorman wasn't her protection. He was a node. A witness. A signal. At 10:14 p.m. Tony hissed, "We come back tomorrow. We'll catch her leaving. We'll get her connections." Frank said, "You can come back tomorrow." "I will." Tony's eyes narrowed. "You getting brave now?" Frank's tone didn't change. "No. I'm getting accurate." Tony and the quiet man left. Their footsteps sounded too loud, like the street was refusing to absorb them. Frank stayed. Not because he thought he could do anything to her. Because he needed to know what kind of woman walked into a building like that and made men open doors before she touched the handle. April 8, 1932. 7:02 a.m. Sugar Hill. Frank returned early when the city's day was still assembling itself. Cold air, thin sunlight, delivery carts starting their routes. This was the hour when a tail could pretend to be a worker on his way to a shift. He waited across from the building, tucked behind a newspaper, eyes above the print. At 7:19 a.m. Stephanie appeared. Same coat. Same gloves. Same pearls. Same discipline. No entourage. No bodyguard. Just Stephanie. She walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk like she wasn't exiting a home, she was entering a plan. Frank followed at a longer distance this time, more careful. He watched her pass a corner shop where the owner, a black woman in a neat coat, paused mid-task to meet Stephanie's gaze. A nod passed between them. Not friendly. Not secretive. Official. Like business. At 7:33 a.m., Stephanie stopped briefly at a payphone outside a small storefront. She didn't speak long. Frank couldn't hear, only saw the shape of her mouth, the calm pace of her breath, the way her shoulders never tightened. When she hung up, she didn't linger. She didn't need to. Frank wrote one line in his notebook. Phone call. No hesitation. Not afraid of being seen. He realized something else. She used public spaces on purpose. Because public spaces meant witnesses. Harlem witnesses. And witnesses were a kind of armor. At 7:51 a.m., Stephanie walked past a barber shop where men were already posted in the morning light. Coffee cups, newspapers, quiet talk. One man shifted his stance, subtly blocking the view from the doorway without making it look like a block. Frank saw it for what it was. A screen. Not a threat. A courtesy. Harlem rearranging itself, half an inch at a time, around her path. Frank's stomach tightened again. He'd been paid to watch her routes. But the longer he watched, the more obvious the truth became. Her route wasn't just a path. It was a network. And Frank was the only one of the six disciplined enough to admit what that meant. April 8, 1932. 1:06 p.m. Downtown. Frank stood in the back of a smoke-heavy room while Tony reported to their boss. A man who kept his voice low because he didn't like wasting volume. Tony tried to make quitting sound tactical. It was nothing. She's cautious. Keeps to herself. Frank spoke before he could stop himself. No, he said. The boss's eyes cut to him. No. Frank felt the room tighten. Men didn't like being corrected, especially not in front of other men. But Frank kept his tone level. She doesn't keep to herself. Tony's jaw flexed. What are you talking about? Frank chose his words like he was defusing a bomb. I'm talking about how doors open for her. I'm talking about how men step aside without her asking. I'm talking about how she uses daylight like it's protection. She's not hiding. The boss leaned forward slightly. Describe her. Frank swallowed once. Then he gave the truth as clean as he could. She walks like she's on record, he said. Like everything you do around her gets remembered. Like she's not looking for danger because she already knows where it is. Tony scoffed. That's poetry. Frank shook his head. No. It's warning. The boss stared at him for a long moment, smoke curling between them. And why'd you stay on her? Frank didn't pretend it was bravery. Because I wanted to know what scares 5 men out of the same job. The boss's mouth tightened. And? Frank's answer landed quiet but heavy. It isn't her temper. It's her preparation. The room went still. Even Tony stopped moving. The boss finally spoke slow. You saying a woman's got Harlem wired up like a precinct? Frank didn't flinch. I'm saying Harlem moves for her like it's practiced. The boss's eyes narrowed, recalculating. You keep watching. You bring me names, places, times. Frank nodded once. Yes. But as he left the room, he understood the trap in the order. If he kept watching Stephanie St. Clair, he wasn't just gathering information. He was exposing himself to her system. And if she was as prepared as she looked, then every hour he stayed on her wasn't making her more vulnerable. It was making him more known. April 9, 1932. 5:27 a.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. Before Harlem fully woke, Stephanie St. Clair was already seated at her desk, coat on, gloves laid neatly beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing. The west-facing windows were still dark. The radiator clicked with that stubborn, uneven rhythm old buildings used to announce morning. On her blotter, a ledger opened to payroll columns. Names in careful handwriting. Route notes. Times. Small figures that looked harmless until you understood they were the spine of an economy. And beside it, separate, deliberate, another stack. Thin folders. Not thick enough to look dramatic. Not heavy enough to look like trouble. Paper was never heavy until it landed in the right hands. Dorothy Sims stood quietly by the doorway, hat in her lap, eyes trying to stay steady. Winston Pace hovered a step behind her, doing his best imitation of calm. Stephanie didn't look up right away. She finished writing one line in the ledger. Underlined it once. Then she spoke, measured, almost conversational. They hired 6 men, she said. Dorothy's throat tightened. We never said that aloud. I didn't need you to, Stephanie replied. Harlem said it for you. Harlem always says it. Winston swallowed. What do we do? Stephanie turned a page, slow, controlling the room with the speed of her hands. What we do, she said, is we stop treating their attention like a threat. She finally raised her eyes. We treat it like a gift. Dorothy frowned, the schoolteacher in her refusing to accept nonsense. A gift. A man who follows you, Stephanie said, is doing half the work of introducing himself. She reached to the side of the desk and pulled a plain envelope toward her. No letterhead. No flourish. Just a name written cleanly, Robert Ellis. Robert's coming at 6, she said. He'll take these downtown. Winston stared at the folders. To who? Stephanie didn't answer immediately. She stood, walked to the window and cracked it open. Cold air slid in sharp, honest. She let it sit for a second, then spoke without turning around. To people who don't like surprises, she said. And to people who can't afford to be embarrassed. At 5:41 a.m. the phone rang once. Stephanie picked up on the first ring because she didn't let anything ring twice in her house. Robert Ellis's voice came quick and quiet. Madam, I'm downstairs. Come up, she said. 6 minutes later, Robert stood inside her apartment. Young, neat, disciplined. The kind of young man who could have been swallowed by the depression if he hadn't found work in the only economy Harlem could fully control. Stephanie handed him the envelope. Take this to West 135th first, she said. Then to 7th. Then wait for my call. Robert nodded. No questions. That was the benefit of working for someone who paid on time. Trust became automatic. Dorothy watched him go and whispered, You're moving it already. Stephanie's reply was soft. I moved it yesterday. Today I'm letting the city think it's still here. April 9, 1932. 7:18 a.m. Lenox Avenue. Stephanie walked out into Harlem daylight dressed the way she always dressed when she wanted the record to be clean. Tailored dark coat. Gloves. Pearls. Hat pinned with quiet precision. She did not dress like she was under pressure. She dressed like she was in control of it. Frank Doyle was already on the avenue, pretending to be nothing. Newspaper folded open, eyes above the print. He spotted her the moment she came into view. And he felt that same irritation in his own chest. She wasn't performing caution. She was performing normal. Which was worse. Stephanie crossed toward a storefront window and slowed, just enough to let her reflection appear. Just enough to let him close distance. Just enough to let him believe he was doing his job well. Then she continued walking. Frank followed, disciplined, careful, keeping his face neutral. A black man with a shoeshine kit lifted his eyes as Stephanie passed. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply took a long look at Frank's shoes. The kind of look that wasn't threatening. Just memorizing. Frank felt it like a finger pressed against his collarbone. Not fear. Exposure. At 7:33 a.m., Stephanie paused at a payphone outside a small shop, dialed a number and spoke for less than a minute. Her posture never changed. She didn't hunch. She didn't shield her mouth. She didn't care who saw her making a call. Because she wanted someone to see. Frank wrote in his notebook with a pencil too small to notice. Public phone. Come. No hiding. He didn't realize that as he wrote, another set of eyes was writing him. April 9, 1932. 8:06 a.m. The New York-Amsterdam news office. The newsroom smelled like ink, hot metal, and cigarettes. Typewriters clacked in uneven rhythm, like a factory making sentences. Men in shirt sleeves moved fast, not because they loved speed but because delay could cost them a story, or cost them their jobs. James Hicks looked up when Stephanie entered. He stood, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just the small instinctive rise people did when they recognized a force that didn't need permission. "Madame St. Clair," he said carefully. "You came early." Stephanie removed one glove, slowly, and set it in her palm like she didn't rush for anyone. "I didn't come for conversation," she said. "I came for placement." Hicks motioned her into a small side room where the door could close without looking like secrecy. When they sat, he said quietly, "You sound like something's moving." Stephanie held his gaze. "Men downtown paid to put shadows on Lenox Avenue," she said. "They think their shadows will teach them my business." Hicks's pen hovered. "And you're telling me because their shadows are sloppy," Stephanie cut in. "And Harlem deserves to know who is studying it." Hicks's eyes narrowed. "You have names?" Stephanie slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Not a confession. Not a rant. A clean list, descriptions, times, a car make, and one partial plate number." Hicks read it once, then again. "This is careful," he said. "It's accurate," Stephanie replied. "That matters more." He looked up. "What do you want printed?" Stephanie didn't say, "I want war." She didn't have to. "I want a story that makes them visible," she said. "Not loud. Precise. The kind of story that makes men who enjoy the dark realize they're standing in daylight." Hicks exhaled slowly. "If I run this, they'll lean on us." Stephanie's voice stayed calm. "They already lean on you. I'm offering you something better than fear." "What?" "A reason," she said. "And a record." Hicks sat back, measuring her the way a journalist measures a source who never wastes words. "Give me until tomorrow," he said. Stephanie stood, glove back on. "Give me until noon," she corrected. "Men like this don't respect deadlines unless the deadline bites." April 9, 1932. 9:42 a.m. Near the 28th precinct. Stephanie did not enter the precinct the way frightened people entered precincts. She walked in as if she belonged to the building's air. The desk officer looked past her at first. Automatic, the old reflex of a world trained to ignore black women unless they were pleading. "Can I help you?" he asked, tone already bored. Stephanie did not answer him. She looked slightly to the side, and a man in plain clothes stepped out from a doorway, Irish, mid-30s, sharp eyes. A contact. Not a friend. The distinction mattered. He nodded once. "Madam." The desk officer blinked, recalibrating. Stephanie followed the plainclothes man into a narrow room where the walls had heard too much. He spoke low. "You're being watched." Stephanie removed a folder from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. Not thick, not dramatic. Just enough weight to change a conversation. "Yes," she said. "And now so are they." The man didn't open it right away. "What is this?" "Names that don't belong in Harlem," Stephanie replied. "And the men who hired them." His eyes sharpened. "You're sure?" Stephanie's gaze didn't move. "I don't bring guesses into buildings like this." He paused, then asked the question men always asked when a woman showed competence. "Why are you doing this?" Stephanie answered like it was the simplest arithmetic on earth. "Because they are pressuring my people," she said. "And because pressure is only useful when it flows one direction." The man studied her face, then finally opened the folder. His expression didn't change much, but his posture did. A slight straightening. A subtle seriousness. He looked up. "What do you want from me?" Stephanie's voice lowered, not softer, sharper. "I want a traffic stop," she said. "Not an arrest. Not a beating. I want their car remembered. I want their names written. I want them to feel the city's pen touch their shoulder." The man hesitated. "That's delicate." Stephanie nodded. "So am I." He stared at her a moment longer, then said, "I'll see what can be done." Stephanie closed the folder with 2 fingers. "Do," she said. "Before noon." April 9, 1932. 11:58 a.m. Downtown, the smoke-heavy room. Frank stood again near the back as Tony tried to sound in control. "She's not doing nothing," Tony insisted. "She walks. She calls. She goes to church. She." The boss lifted a hand. Silence. He didn't like wasting time on certainty that sounded like wishful thinking. Then the phone rang. One ring. A man answered, listened, and his face changed, tightening at the jaw, not with anger, with calculation. He covered the receiver, looked at the boss, and said, "Amsterdam News is asking questions." Tony's mouth opened. About what? The man didn't even look at Tony. About white men tailing a Harlem businesswoman. About a dark sedan on Lenox. About why it's in the neighborhood. The room went still. The boss's eyes narrowed. Who talked? No one answered because no one could. That was the point. Frank felt his stomach drop, not because he was scared of violence but because he understood systems. He understood how quickly a small observation became a public fact in a neighborhood that communicated faster than ink. The boss turned his eyes onto Frank. "You," he said. "What did you tell anyone?" Frank's voice came out clean. "Nothing." The boss stared at him. "Then how does a newspaper have our shadow work on a clock?" Frank didn't try to be brave. He tried to be correct. "Because she wanted it there," he said. Tony scoffed. "That's..." Frank cut him off, eyes still on the boss. "She didn't hide from us. She used us. She let us follow where she wanted witnesses. She made our job visible on purpose." The boss's mouth tightened, not in rage, worse. In realization. He leaned back and said quietly, "Call it off." Tony jerked forward. "We can't just..." "Yes," the boss said, voice suddenly flat. "We can. Because this isn't surveillance anymore. This is her sending a message." He looked at Frank like Frank was the only one in the room who had seen the message forming. Frank didn't celebrate. He didn't smirk. He simply said the truth that had been building since the first door opened for her on Sugar Hill. "She's not being hunted," Frank said. "She's taking attendance." The boss stared through smoke for a long moment. Then he spoke, almost to himself. "A woman," he said, like the word tasted unfamiliar. "A woman turned our men into a newspaper story. And that was the reversal, not a gunshot, not a fist fight. Just a city that suddenly had the right names at the right time in the right hands." Outside, Harlem kept moving. Slips folded. Coins counted. Doors opened. Routes ran. And Stephanie St. Clair sat somewhere above it all, calm enough to let other men feel panic on her behalf. Because she had done what she always did best. She took what was meant to threaten her. And made it evidence. April 10, 1932. 6:44 a.m. Harlem. The first sign it was over didn't arrive with a meeting. Or a gunshot. Or an apology. It arrived the way Harlem measured danger, by what stopped happening. On Lenox Avenue, the same barbershop lights came on. The same fruit vendors laid out oranges in neat pyramids. The same streetcar screamed against the tracks like it always did, metal teeth on metal rail. But the men with clean shoes, the ones who'd been hovering a little too long at corners, pretending to wait for nothing, weren't there. Harlem noticed the absence the way a church notices an empty pew. Quietly. Immediately. And inside 409 Edgecombe Avenue on Sugar Hill, Stephanie St. Clair treated that absence like a receipt, proof that the transaction had gone through. Dorothy Sims arrived just after 7, a small stack of slips under her arm, her hat pinned precise like she'd taught herself order out of necessity. Winston Pace came behind her, posture still too tense, like his body hadn't accepted the good news yet. "Madam," Dorothy said, standing in the doorway as if crossing into the room required permission, not because Stephanie demanded it, but because the room had become what she built. "They're gone." Stephanie didn't look up from the ledger. She turned one page, smoothed it with 2 fingers and kept writing. "Which ones?" she asked. Winston blinked. "All of them. The white men. The car too." Stephanie's pen paused, just a heartbeat, then continued as if she'd only been confirming the weather. "Good," she said. "Then we can work." Dorothy couldn't stop herself. "That's it? No speech. No warning to the neighborhood." Stephanie finally lifted her eyes. "Come." Unhurried. Like she'd been interrupted during arithmetic. "Harlem doesn't need a speech," she said. "Harlem has eyes." She went back to the ledger. Because this was always the point, the real victory wasn't loud. The real victory was continuity, runners paid on Friday, slips collected in the morning, groceries still bought, rent still met. In an economy built on fragile trust, panic was a tax Stephanie refused to charge her own people. And while her office returned to routine, the men who hired the tail were learning what it meant to become visible in a neighborhood that remembered faces. By mid-morning, a story began moving through Harlem like a current. Not shouted, not posted, passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, barber chair to church pew. White men had been following Madame St. Clair. And the Amsterdam News had questions. Stephanie had used the press before. She'd taken out ads, written public letters, placed her enemies and corrupt officials in print because she understood something most men didn't. A gun ends one problem. A headline creates 10 new ones. Witnesses, records, pressure from people who feared embarrassment more than prison. At 12:36 p.m., a copy of the paper ended up on a barbershop counter near 125th. Men leaned in over it the way they leaned over payroll checks, carefully, reverently reading between lines. No one needed the paper to say everything. Harlem understood the meaning without the details. They tried to map her. She mapped them. And downtown, in the smoke-heavy room where men liked to pretend they owned the night, the response was exactly what Stephanie predicted. Irritation turned to caution, caution turned to retreat. Frank Doyle, the only one who stayed, returned there once more, not because he wanted the work, but because he needed his money and he needed to leave the job without looking afraid. Tony was already talking too fast. "We should have leaned harder," Tony insisted. "We should have stayed closer. She's just a woman with a routine." The boss didn't look at Tony. His eyes were on Frank. "Tell me again," the boss said, voice low. "What she looked like." Frank kept his posture neutral. That was his only talent. "She looked prepared," he said. The boss's mouth tightened. "Prepared how?" Frank chose precision over drama. "Like she wanted to be seen in the places she stood," Frank said. "Like she used daylight. Like she knew the difference between a corner that hides you and a corner that witnesses you." Tony scoffed. "That don't mean nothing." Frank's eyes shifted toward Tony for the first time. "It means everything," Frank said, and his voice surprised even him. "Because the neighborhood moved around her. Doors opened before she touched them. People looked at us like we were the ones who didn't belong. And now the paper's sniffing around our car. That isn't luck." The boss stared through the smoke a long moment, like he was watching an equation solve itself. Then he spoke, not angry, worse. "Controlled. Jobs like this," he said, "are supposed to make them nervous." Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. The boss leaned back. "You're done. All of you. Nobody goes near her again." Tony lurched forward. "We can't just back off." "Yes," the boss said, cutting him off with a softness that carried threat. "We can." He looked at Frank again. "And you, forget what you saw." Frank almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was impossible. Men like Frank survived by remembering things. And Stephanie St. Clair had been built on the same skill. Memory turned into leverage, details turned into control. Frank left with his pay and a new understanding he didn't want, that the woman he'd been hired to observe was not a target at all. She was a system. Back in Harlem, Stephanie's life stayed stubbornly ordinary. That was her kind of domination. On Sunday, April 17, 1932, 10:45 a.m., she walked into Abyssinian Baptist Church and took her seat, the third row as consistent as a signature. Hats rustled. Coats brushed pew wood. Sunlight broke into the sanctuary through stained glass and made the air look almost permanent. After service in the vestibule, an older woman touched Stephanie's arm. No words, just a nod. The kind of nod that said, "We saw it. We understood it. And we remember who kept the lights on in hard times." Stephanie returned the nod, equally quiet. Because she didn't need trophies. She needed Harlem to keep breathing. Years later, men would tell stories about Harlem like it was built by male violence alone. They'd name gunmen and bosses and enforcers. They'd center legends who loved the camera. But the record, the true record, still carries a different line. That Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson became an associate and enforcer for numbers Queen Madame Stephanie St. Clair, climbing through a world she already controlled. That's what Harlem remembers even when the rest of the world forgets. Stephanie St. Clair didn't win by being louder than men. She won by being earlier. By being calmer. By being so prepared that a squad of paid shadows only proved what she already knew. Harlem wasn't a place you could steal with confidence. Not while Queenie was watching.